Those who travel furthest should thank their hosts most profusely. Rest assured, this is neither a Confucian teaching nor any other ethical commandment, but it's the, linguistic expression of my heartfelt wish to thank Professor Yehuda Halper, my colleague and dear host, as well as Bar-Ilan University sincerely for inviting me to this very special celebration of Professor Stephen Harvey's retirement today. Now, as a young scholar and a Latinist, on top of this, so as someone works in a related field to Professor Harvey's academic pursuits, and not in the same field, I'm deeply honored to be speaking today to celebrate his lifelong scholarship together with the greatest scholars of Jewish philosophy and the history of science. So thank you once again for having me here. Today we have gathered for a happy occasion indeed. Professor Stephen Harvey, who has given his entire professional life to the study of Jewish and Arabic philosophy at this distinguished institution, is about to enter, I would say, a new phase of his academic life. So I wouldn't call it retirement. While it strikes me that retiring professionals in most other professions seek new activities for their lives after work, such as traveling the world, golfing, or volunteering, Professor Harvey seems to have his future mapped out in a different direction. In fact, I take it that the new phase of his life that he's now officially entering does not seem to be new in the sense of a shift of activities, rather it seems to be new in the sense of perspective. While the long professional phase of his career here at Bar-Ilan University could be characterized as climbing the mountain of academic distinction, sophistication, and renown, and we all have gathered here to attest to Professor Harvey's excellence in so doing, he can now truly enjoy the view from the peak of this distinction. The time is right for him, so it seems, to indulge in the harvest of his work, his formidable scholarship, and his many merits that we as his colleagues all know so well. It will certainly be on him to put shape to this new panoramic phase of his academic pursuits, but possibly we can play a little part too. We could, for instance, thank Professor Harvey for his work with invitations to keynotes at big conferences and continue to celebrate his work in this way, or we could honor his future academic goals by providing him with the time and space to bring them into existence. Word has it that there are plans for a book. Yet it is Professor Harvey's privilege alone to choose from these honors that we will certainly give him, and to turn his gaze wherever he sees most benefits for his future endeavors. May all of your coming years at the academic peak, Professor Harvey, be blessed with everything that you require to realize your visions, projects, and pursuits over the coming years. We shall support them and delight in them. Now, customarily, academic celebrations such as today's do not only consist in congratulatory speeches, which is the one that I have given or tried to give right now, but that pay tribute to life's work of outstanding scholarship. They also encourage us as a community to share some of our work in honor of the outstanding scholarship that we're celebrating today. My talk, therefore, is intended to do so, and I hope that despite its brevity and its persuasive rather than argumentative nature, it can fulfill its purpose. Okay. Philosophers know that wisdom has been passed down to us. We've all studied it, as has the love for it. Some not only know it, but also live their lives in accordance with it. Throughout history, philosophers have aspired to explore, understand, and even penetrate the truths about God, the world, and human existence. One topic that has always been an object of such endeavors is happiness, perhaps because, like no other topic, it conjoins their philosophical aspirations and their purpose in life. Medieval lovers of wisdom who inquired into happiness were as much bound to a history of wisdom concerning it as we are today. But what was it that shaped their history of wisdom concerning happiness? What was it, the influence of their sources, the integral arguments, characteristic ideas, or definitions of concepts that they employed, or was it all factors taken together? Or were there even additional factors? Now, in interpreting the theories of happiness propounded by our medieval actors, and I speak for the Latin scholarship here, we have tended to explain the theories' internal structures, namely the arguments, ideas, and definitions of concepts. In contextualizing these structures, we have mostly relied on causal accounts that examine the influence of the sources used by our medieval actors. Unquestionably, these approaches have produced important and enlightening research that has both enriched and advanced our understanding, but I wonder whether their success has numbed us to the possibility of other approaches that could meaningfully complement and enrich the former. The purpose of my short presentation today, which is a very abridged form of a full paper, is to show how our traditional histories can be supplemented by a complementary history that considers how a medieval theory articulates the actor's personal history and his continual conversations with the people surrounding him. Indeed, I have become increasingly convinced that to appreciate Thomas Aquinas' theory of happiness, probably most widely known in non-Latin circles as the theologian of the Latin West in the 13th century, it is important to understand Thomas as a real person. Accordingly, I consider it useful to distinguish among three factors in his overall theorizing. The factors aimed at building his theory by way of syllogistic arguments and technical terms, on the one hand, the factors intended to integrate his theory with the living debates of his times, so speaking to other thinkers, and third, the factors that draw a link to socio-political and other concerns of his day, educational concerns as well. In this way, shifts and variations in Thomas Aquinas' theorizing may be read not only as a development of doctrine or influence of new sources, as is typical in most current scholarship on Aquinas, but rather as expressions of his engagement with the living debates of his times, his educational interests, and his church political activities. Now, in order to show the value and interest of this kind of historization, I shall focus on one specific area in Thomas's account of happiness, and that is ultimate happiness. Namely, how God makes possible and facilitates ultimate human happiness, which Aquinas sees in the attainment of the beatific vision. The beatific vision is the vision of God face to face in the afterlife, not in this life. So he didn't like the ideas of Averroes and others in his sources. This idea of divine facilitation found its characteristic articulations and expressions in the key concepts that Aquinas used. Concepts such as the light of glory, disposition, similitude, participation, and deiformity, or divine likeness. Concepts that shed light on the commitments and convictions which Aquinas held and the combinations of ideas which he proposed in his three major works of systematic theology. What we will see that when we consider these concepts together, instead of analyzing them in isolation, they reveal an intricate history of theological theorizing, magisterial decisions, educational endeavors, and socio-political events that occurred before and during Aquinas' lifetime. So I will first look very briefly at Aquinas' commentary on the sentences, which is basically like his PhD thesis, which he wrote in 1252 to 1255, and show that in this work he builds his theory of this divine facilitation for ultimate happiness. In the second part, I will look very briefly at his Summa contra Gentiles, or Sum against the heathens or Gentiles, which he wrote from 1259 to 1264, and illustrate on this work how he basically situates himself in the living debates of his time. And in the third part, I will turn to his well-known Summa Theologiae, which he wrote from 1265 to 1268, at least for the first part, where he situates his theorizing within wider concerns of his times. Okay. So, when in his commentary on the sentences, so the young Thomas Aquinas articulated for the first time the idea that attaining ultimate happiness is possible only if it is facilitated by God, he justified his theory on two general principles. First, that knowing God requires an intellectual union between him and the intellect, the human intellect, which occurs only if the divine essence assumes the function of an intelligible species in the intellect, so that human knowing basically works like it works in this world. And two, that conjunction between a form and its subject is possible only if the subject has the proper disposition. And then we see Aquinas say about this. In order for an intellect to see God through his essence, it is required that the divine essence be united with our intellect in some way as its intelligible form. But a form is conjoined to its perfectible subject only when it has the dispositions by which it is rendered disposed to be affected by such a form, just as a body is united to a soul only when it has the proper dispositions to receive the soul, unquote. Now, in the first principle, Aquinas unequivocally refers to the intellectual act of the beatific vision, resuming his discussion from an earlier article, a discussion which was most interestingly guided by Averroes's long commentary on Aristotle's De Anima. In the second principle, Aquinas qualified the first with a quasi-ontological condition of a proper disposition that the intellect requires. The two premises of act and qualifying ontology, as they are stated here, required Aquinas to conclude that, quote, in order for the intellect to be united with the divine essence in this way, it must contain something by way of a disposition which prepares it for the said union. So again, he repeats the importance of the disposition. Most interestingly, though, Aquinas couches his solution or his entire argumentative justification for the idea that the attainment of ultimate happiness is only possible if facilitated by God into an Aristotelian language here. The key concepts that he uses, such as intelligible form, form conjoined, perfectible subject, and disposition, all testify to the appropriation of Aristotelian thought in his commentary on the sentences. This is even more striking in light of the absence of the key concepts that Aquinas' neo-contemporaries typically deployed in discussing the very same idea that you need a new disposition, that attaining ultimate happiness is possible only if God facilitates it. Aquinas' own tradition exposed him to ways of theorizing that drew on entirely different and much more traditional concepts that had been around in the Latin debates for centuries. These concepts were participation and similitude, or the Greek Christian concepts were theophany and deiformity. Now, you can read in much greater detail how Aquinas' contemporaries employed these concepts when this paper will be published, but now you have to take my word on it. The only concept that Aquinas used to forge a link between the concept of disposition, or his Aristotelianization, and the Latin living debates that surrounded him was the concept of light of glory. But what did Aquinas achieve with this link? I think that he really wanted to craft an entirely new explanatory space which offered an Aristotelian framework to explain the beatific vision, or seeing God face to face, and that he wished to set new argumentative standards that could not be found in his neo-contemporaries. Aquinas shifted away from the predominant framework of his contemporaries, which was Platonic and Augustinian in nature, by narrowing down the richer and more elastic explanations of the light of glory across a continuum of lights that emanated from the divine source by way of a diffusion to an increasingly specified and rigid explanation with clear-cut boundaries through his Aristotelianization. So we can say that theory building along the lines of a new methodological framework, criteria, and standards stood at the forefront of Aquinas' practices of theorization when he was young. The building of his theory and its adjustments to new standards of Aristotelian philosophy were prominent, while the reference to the light of glory seemed more decorative than genuinely explanatory. But what will happen in his more mature works? Now, when we turn our attention to the Summa Contra Gentiles, the work that he wrote between 1259 and 64, we find that Aquinas continued to use the concept of disposition to explain the divine facilitation. So his theory building remained the same. But he now enriched his theory building with some traditional concepts that he found in his Latin contemporaries, the concept of similitude and of participation. Now, these concepts added new dimensions of meaning to Aquinas' overall practices of theorization because they helped him integrate his theory building with the living debates of his times. In the full paper, I discuss exactly how this works. But they also provided Aquinas with a rational justification of the divine facilitation for the beatific vision. They specified the precise effect that this facilitation would have, and last but not least, reduced the relevance of the concept of the light of glory, on which he had relied when he was young, to a mere metaphorical status. So this second stage marked a key stage in his appropriation of traditional Latin terms, because he reintroduces them into his own debates. But one term is conspicuously absent from this. The term deification, the Greek Christian term. Now, when Aquinas wrote the Summa Contra Gentiles, during that time, he was preoccupied with texts of Greek Christian origin at the very same time. Pope Urban IV commissioned Thomas Aquinas to compose two writings that were solidly concerned with Greek patristic and medieval sources. These two works were called Catena Aurea on the one hand and Against the Errors of the Greeks on the other. So it was inevitable that at the very time of writing the Contra Gentiles, Aquinas would have considered the import of these discussions for supplementing his own theorizations. Now, what were these two works? The former work was a running commentary on the four Gospels, and it compiled patristic texts by following the example of the gloss. So you basically have a lemma and then you comment on it. Probably thanks to his access to the library of Monte Cassino and the archives of the papal court, as Jean-Pierre Tourelle has explained, Aquinas could reference a remarkable amount of Greek Orthodox sources that were previously unknown to the Latin West. In all, he included 57 Greek authors, as well as the acts of the first 5 ecumenical councils of the Church. In the other work, the Contra Errores Graecorum, or Against the Errors of the Greeks, Aquinas covered a very similar material, but on a much narrower level. He examined theological questions that would be of immediate relevance to the negotiations that the Catholic Church would lead with the Orthodox Church concerning reunification some years later at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. And most interestingly, these included the term of the filioque in the Nicene Creed, the primacy of the Pope, the Eucharistic bread, and the existence of purgatory. But also, in this work, the key relevant term to deify and its cognates occurs 10 times in quotations of Greek Christian origin that Aquinas includes, and yet it does not occur in the Contra Gentiles in the context of God helping the human intellect to attain the beatific vision. Now, this conspicuous absence in the years from 1259 to 1264 reveals Aquinas' rather focused concentration, I argue, in his theorizations and exclusive engagement with the frameworks of thought that included the concepts of similitude and participation, so with the living debates of his times, but not with these Greek sources. But Aquinas finally turned to the concept of deiformity some years later in his Summa Theologia, where he introduced it into his theorization of this divine facilitation of the beatific vision, as we will see in the following quote. And we call this augmentation of the intellectual powers illumination, just as the intelligible object itself is called emitted light or source of light, and this is the light by which it is said in the Apocalypse that the clarity of God has enlightened it, namely the society of the blessed who see God, and by this light they are rendered deiform, that is similar to God according to 1 John 2:2. When he will appear, we shall be like him, and we shall see him as he is, unquote. Now, so the question now is obviously, does this concept of deiformity or deiformis suddenly occur here in this context? At first sight, it seems plausible that Aquinas might have appropriated this concept in order to participate further in the living debates of his times, especially because some other thinkers used it. But when we consider the fact that most of the works of his near contemporaries were of a much older date, and he knew these works some years earlier, some of them actually before writing his PhD thesis or the commentary on the sentences, such an explanation is not really persuasive. So when we start thinking about the time and space of writing this first part of the Summa Theologia, a time and space which concurred with its founding of the new Dominican Studium in Rome, and a very close proximity to the papal court in those years, Aquinas might have had another purpose in mind, apart from theorization and integration with living debates. What I suggest then is that the introduction of this concept of deiformity in the first part of the Summa Theologia spoke as much to Aquinas' immediate educational purposes within the Dominican order as it did to the political concerns. Now, what seems to fit well with this agenda was Aquinas' intention to further the program that he had begun already in these works writing on the Greeks earlier, where he explicitly stated that he wished to rectify Greek Christian teachings concerning also those of deiformity. His mature writings support such a reading, because for Aquinas the concept of deiformity in these later works seemed to have involved Greek Christian teaching which was insufficiently translated with this concept, adopted by his Latin contemporaries in this Greek meaning, which seemed to involve an inappropriate and rather literal deification of humans, or becoming godlike, as opposed to the traditional Latin meaning. And so as a result, for Aquinas, the Latin teachings of his neo-contemporaries concerning the divine facilitation of the beatific vision resulted in an understanding without sufficient clarity. And if you teach this to your students, obviously, then you have a problem, because then the doctrine is no longer clear. Aquinas, however, had long worked out before what he took to be a better account of divine facilitation through the Aristotelian concept of disposition. This account, together with the new insight of reframing the meaning of these Greek Christian concepts, thus paved the way for him to introduce the concept of deiformity into his mature discussions, but in a very different sense than any of his contemporaries would use it. So Aquinas' repeated use of the concept of deiformis in his theorizations concerning the divine facilitation shows that its significance was not only a matter of theorization, but also a matter of real life, be it his education or political purposes, which I could not discuss here. His use of deiformis in the context of the beatific vision late in life served purposes that most likely transcended motives of theory building and integration into living debates. Okay. So I conclude. In this brief presentation today, I have given you an excerpt of a much longer examination that concerned Aquinas' theorizations of the beatific vision, or to be more precise, the divine facilitation of it. What is striking is that while building this theory, the theory building itself remained essentially the same. This positio was always at the heart of the theory. But the terms of explanations and the motivations changed, and so did additional terms enter the debate. In drawing this distinction, I have tried to suggest that it's insufficient for a full appreciation of Aquinas' theorizations to focus on philosophical meaning alone and to assume that Aquinas' sources shaped his theorizations in the same manner as did the debates surrounding him, and to presuppose that developments of his theorizations can be read without recourse to historical events. The reality that emerges from Aquinas' texts when they are read in a complementary or in a holistic way seems to be more compelling. It shows that at times a philosopher's theorization can only be fathomed through consideration of what is going on in his life and his consequent concerns at the time of his writing a particular work. Now, none of this should be surprising if we consider that Aquinas' theorizations were to a great extent an expression of the culture around him at a particular time and in a particular space. Aquinas was a theologian of the 13th century, very much engaged with the concerns of his times, one who wrote about ultimate happiness for his peers as much as for the papal court, and a theologian who was part of an important church political decision to be taken just after his death. And it is precisely against this background that he selected the sources, ideas, and concepts that he deemed relevant for shaping his own theory of ultimate happiness. Thank you very much for your attention.
You mentioned in the very beginning the beatific view. Could the beatific view?
Vision, yeah.
Vision. Could you please elaborate a little bit about it?
Sure.
And specifically why it's only after that?
Right. So those are two questions. So the question obviously goes back to the Bible. And in the Bible, you get two opposite views on that question of whether God can be seen directly or immediately or face to face, and at what point in time he can be seen. There are different views too in the Bible, right? So you get, for instance, verses on Moses where he is wrapped and he will see God in this life. Now, in the Latin tradition, this is very much shaped by discussions that we find in Augustine, where Augustine says, yes, Moses and Paul were the two people that actually did see God face to face in this life, but this meant also that we would be wrapped out of like this very state of the way in which we know now. So we have to be carried upwards to like a heavenly understanding or something like that. Whereas Augustine would also say that a true intellectual vision of God that is stable and permanent, not just transient as was the case for Moses and Paul, would just come after this life. So this criterion of stability and static kind of happiness was something that was decisive for the Latin West to say that ultimate happiness can actually really come in the afterlife. And you find this in Boethius and in Augustine and then obviously in all the subsequent discussions. The beatific vision itself, the biggest problem in the early 13th century was this question of whether it is a direct vision or an indirect vision. And that was down to a number of historical factors that came together. So there was an Avicennian strand that interpreted Metaphysics 3.8, Avicenna's Metaphysics 3.8, in a particular way, together with Pseudo-Dionysius' apophatic writings. And they would say, well, you can't really see God directly, but you can only see his actualities or emanations. And that was a huge problem, and that was condemned in 1241. And then Albert the Great, Aquinas' teacher, and Aquinas were arguing against this, but with different instruments, so to speak, philosophical instruments. And so that's the whole story. Is this okay? Great.
Yes. A short question.
Yes.
In the Tractatus contra Gentiles, who are the Gentiles? No, shortly.
Well, I mean, this has been a matter of scholarly debate for decades, if not a century. And I have my own take on this, which has not been published. But when you know Aquinas' teacher, so I'll tell you, since this is kind of private, right? So when you know Aquinas' teacher very well, Albert the Great, yeah, thanks for this. And you read, especially book 3 of the Summa contra Gentiles, in light of what his teacher had to say, and how some of his commentaries on Aristotle's works might have influenced Aquinas, one might rethink scholarly positions who say that the Gentiles were potentially people that were in Al-Andalus and were the targets of, say, priests, Dominican priests who went there to convert them, or just the pagan sources that Aquinas read, or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to invite Ida Alper to give his speech. Happiness and intellectual